The first thing Rowan saw when she stepped off the afternoon stage was a padlock on the schoolhouse door. The second was 3 children writing letters in the dirt, because the room built for them had been chained shut. The driver set down her teaching trunk with more care than the rest of the freight, perhaps because the word school was painted along its side in neat black letters. Dust spun over the main street in warm yellow sheets. A boarding house with a sagging porch leaned across from the chapel. Beyond it stood the one-room schoolhouse she had pictured through 3 weeks of jolting travel. She had imagined children under its roof, the smell of chalk, and the first careful silence before a lesson. Instead, an iron chain wrapped the bell rope, and a hard black lock held the front door. The children stood in the sliver of shade beside the steps, drawing letters with sticks in the dust. One little girl had written a crooked A. A boy beside her had rubbed out his own words so many times the ground looked wounded. Ivy stared at the lock once, then at the children, then at the folded letter in her glove where Dry Creek's school board had promised she would be met on arrival. She had been that child once, writing in dirt after a teacher left and no adult cared enough to replace her. Dry Creek would not become the 4th town where she carried a teaching trunk away before it was opened. "Who shut it?" she asked. The older girl looked up first. She was perhaps 12, with a wheat-colored braid and wary eyes that had learned too early that adults often arrived carrying decisions, not mercy. "Mrs. Halversen," she said. "She said there would be no term this summer." After writing for a teacher. The girl gave the smallest shrug. Folks here write for lots of things. The driver had already turned away toward the livery. The main street was alive in the careful, sideways fashion of places that pretended not to look while looking at everything. Ivy felt half a dozen eyes on her trunk, her dress, her hat pinned for travel instead of show, and perhaps most of all on the way she did not weep or argue at once. She crossed to the children and lowered herself into the dust. "What is your name?" she asked the older girl. "Me Mercer." "Well, Miss Mercer, if the room is locked, we shall begin without it. Your leans as if the wind has been teaching it manners. Shall we straighten it?" The younger children edged closer. Ivy took the stick from me and drew a cleaner letter beside the first, then another, then a simple word large enough for all of them to follow. "Cat." "Again," she said, handing the stick back. "Not quickly, correctly." The little boy pressed his lips together and copied. Me copied after him, more from habit than hope. Ivy moved to numbers next, using pebbles from the schoolhouse edge. By the time she had the children counting in 2s, she heard the front porch of the boarding house creak behind her. "You need not make a fair out of disappointment, Miss Rowan." The voice carried a sort of polished chill that had learned how to sound respectable while doing harm. Ivy rose and turned. Agnes Halversen stood on the porch steps in brown silk too heavy for the heat and widow's black gloves too elegant for a town like Dry Creek. Her hair was silver and exact. Her expression suggested that order had been offended and expected the world to correct itself. "I should have preferred not to discover my disappointment by padlock," Ivy said. "I sent word to Denver 10 days ago. No such word reached me. Then the post failed us." Agnes's gaze skimmed the children. For one brief second it moved past them, toward the sorting tables at the edge of town, where quick young hands could earn men like Sela's creed a cleaner profit than educated ones. "There will be no term. Dry Creek has other needs." Me lowered her stick. The younger 2 stepped backward as if shame might be catching. "And yet the children remain," Ivy said. "Children remain everywhere. Schooling is a luxury where crops fail and ore prices fall." "Your letter did not call it a luxury." Agnes descended 1 step, not enough to come level. "You are a single woman in a working settlement. The decent course is to take tonight's westbound stage or tomorrow morning's if you require rest. Mrs. Vale may give you supper before you go." "You wrote for a schoolteacher," Ivy said. not a passing guest. We wrote before circumstances changed. Me was staring at the dust again. Ivy saw then that the true cruelty of towns was often not noise but habit. Dry Creek had taught its children to stand beside a locked door and call that ordinary. "Miss Mercer," Ivy said, loud enough for the street to hear, "read the word." Me startled. Agnes's brows came together. "That is enough," Agnes said. Me looked from one woman to the other. Then, because children were often braver than the towns that claimed to protect them, she said, "Cat." "Good, and this one." Ivy scratched a new word in the dust. "Bell." Me read again, quieter. The little boy read after her and got it wrong and then right. By then a man had stopped at the hitch rail across the street, hat in hand, watching not Ivy but the children's faces. Agnes's mouth thinned. "Do not perform at me, Miss Rowan. There is no salary, no room, no use." "No use to whom?" That landed. A cough sounded from somewhere behind the mercantile. Mrs. Vale, the boarding house keeper, had come halfway onto her porch and then frozen there with her apron caught in one fist. "If practicality means children who cannot sign their own names," Ivy said, "your town is paying dearly for it." Agnes's eyes hardened. "Take care, you know nothing of this place." "Then tell me what I should know." "That no one here asked to be judged by a woman who has not spent a day in our dust." The hitch rail man crossed the street then, slow and straight. He was taller than most men Ivy had known, broad through the shoulders without carrying himself like he expected admiration for it. His hat was dark, and his eyes were darker, steady as river stone. Dust lay pale across his boots. He was not handsome in the polished way cities praised. He was steadier than that, and every louder thing nearby seemed cheaply made beside him. He looked first at the word in the dirt, then at the chain on the bell rope, then at Agnes. "You said there'd be a teacher," he said. "The board changed course." "You changed course," he said, calm enough to make it more dangerous. Agnes's chin lifted. "Mr. Mercer, if your niece needs letters, I believe I manage well enough with a Bible and an almanac. Me needs more than weather and warning." Me had gone still as a fence post. Agnes turned to Ivy as if he had not spoken. "Miss Rowan, I advise you to leave by sundown. A settlement like this can ruin a woman's name faster than it can replace a school bell." "I have had my name handled by worse hands than Dry Creek's," she said. "It is still mine." Something changed in the man's face at that. Not surprise exactly, recognition perhaps. Agnes looked from Ivy to him and saw it too. "Do not make yourself responsible for her," she said to him. "People are already talking about your house having no woman in it." "People talk when the wind drops," he said. "It's how they fill the quiet." Agnes's gaze sharpened. "And your contracts, Mr. Mercer, will you fill those with defiance?" He did not answer her at once. He turned instead to Ivy. "You need a room for tonight?" he asked. "Apparently," Ivy said. "And a place to teach, if you mean to stay till morning." "More than till morning, if I can help it." He nodded once as if that had been the answer he expected. "My hayloft is empty after first cutting. Good light. Cedar Ridge is 5 miles south. My niece lives there. 2 of my hands have children. If you are willing to teach in dust and hay, you can begin tomorrow." Agnes laughed softly. "A schoolhouse in a loft, how noble." He looked at her then, and for the first time his silence felt like a weapon. "More noble than a locked door," he said. "If you love clean frontier romances where one decent choice changes everything, stay with this story and subscribe for more." Agnes's face went pale under the powder at her throat. "You will regret this meddling." "Maybe," he said, "but not as much as I'd regret watching her leave." That was the first time he had said her, without yet knowing her name. Ivy bent to take up her gloves and the folded letter before the dust could claim them too. When she straightened, Me had stepped closer to the man. "Uncle Caleb," she said. So that was his name. "Fetch the mare from the hitch rail," he said gently. "We'll take Miss Rowan's trunk with us." Agnes did not move from the school steps, but she no longer seemed in command of them. Ivy lifted her trunk handle with both hands, and Caleb Mercer took the heavier end without asking permission in the way some men used as a disguise for ownership. Together, they carried it down into the street. "Thank you," she said when they reached the wagon. "I haven't done much yet." In this town, that seems untrue. The corner of his mouth altered, not enough to become a smile. "Maybe wait till you've seen the ranch before deciding I'm useful." Me climbed onto the wagon seat and made room for Ivy with awkward seriousness. Caleb tied the trunk behind them, then handed Ivy a smaller box she had not noticed among the stage freight. "Your books," he said. "Driver nearly loaded them with feed sacks." She held the box a little tighter than necessary. "You noticed. You noticed children learning in dirt before you noticed your own room had vanished." He took the reins. "I suppose we're both paying attention where it counts." The road to Cedar Ridge curled out of town through cottonwoods browned by heat and a creek bed mostly empty, but for glints of slow water trapped under stone. Me sat between Ivy and Caleb and answered questions with the caution of a child who had learned not to burden adults with too much hope at once. "There were 5 regular pupils before the school shut," she said. "Then 3. Then none, because Agnes told the mothers there would be no proper teacher after spring, and Mr. Creed had work for quick hands at the sorting tables. Me's own mother had taught her letters from an old primer until a fever took her 2 years earlier. Since then Caleb had done what he could on winter nights, but ranch work left a man more tired than educated. "And the bell?" Ivy asked. Me twisted her braid. "Mrs. Halversen said children rang it too much." "Children are meant to ring bells too much," Ivy said. Me gave her the first real smile of the day. Cedar Ridge announced itself first by smell: dry hay, sun-heated wood, horses, and the faint mineral scent of the creek widening near the corrals. The ranch house sat long and low under a cottonwood. A bunkhouse stood a little apart. Beyond it rose the hay barn, and above the barn doors a loft window threw back the evening light in 2 clear rectangles. Before Caleb could help Ivy down, a rider passed along the road without stopping. He looked at the trunk, then at the loft, and called out that Silas Creed did not care for ranchers making schools out of barns. Caleb only watched him ride on. "Trouble travels fast here," Ivy said. "Usually on a borrowed horse," Caleb answered. "That's your classroom?" Ivy asked. "If you can forgive the audience for being horses till morning." "I have taught boys who kicked harder." This time he did smile, briefly, and without showing teeth, as if the expression had grown unfamiliar on his face, and did not wish to stay too long where others could witness it. He stopped the wagon near the side porch. A woman of perhaps 50 emerged from the kitchen carrying a pan of beans. Her sleeves were rolled and her hair had escaped every pin it had ever agreed to. She took one look at Ivy, then at Caleb, then at the trunk and books, and made a small sound that held both exhaustion and immediate allegiance. "So they did it," she said. "They did," Caleb answered. "Then they can eat their own plates when the Lord judges them." She shifted the pan and nodded at Ivy. "Marta Ruiz. I cook here when this lot remembers they require civilization. If he told you we had order, he's a liar." "Miss Ivy Rowan," Ivy said. "Teacher?" Marta asked. "Still hoping to be." "Then come inside and eat before hope turns thin." Caleb lifted the trunk again. "I'll put her things in the east room." The room had a bed, a washstand, a chair, and a window looking toward the creek. It was plain enough to be honest. "Me sleeps across the hall," he said. "Marta's room is beyond the kitchen. You'll have the key to this door if you want it." He set a small iron key on the washstand and stepped back at once. as if the gesture might otherwise be misunderstood. "The next stage west leaves at dawn in 3 days," he said. "If you decide this is foolish before then, I'll take you in myself. No one here will stop you. And if I decide it isn't foolish, then the loft is yours for teaching as long as you're willing. What do you want in return?" He considered the question seriously, which made the answer matter more. "For me to read better than I do," he said. "For the others too, if their folks let them come, that's all." It was not all, Ivy thought. No man risked the board chair's anger, Sela's creed's notice, and a town's gossip for nothing. But whatever the rest was, he was too decent to ask it at a bedchamber door. At supper she met the rest of the ranch's orbit quickly. Tomas Ortega, whose daughter Luz needed letters, Benji Pike, red-haired and solemn, and old Mr. Jebb, who claimed not to care for schooling while listening hard enough to miss his own supper. Caleb did not talk much. But when Marta asked whether Miss Rowan could stay under a ranch roof without giving Agnes fresh poison, he answered that the east room had its own key, and the whole valley already knew he could afford his own conscience. Ivy felt the words land inside her with more warmth than the stew. That night she unpacked only what mattered first: primers, arithmetic sheets, slate pencils, copy pages wrapped in oilcloth. The room key stayed on the washstand. She looked at it more than once and understood the quiet promise in it. Her safety was not being offered as a favor. Caleb had treated it as a fact that should have existed before he arrived. The next morning the loft smelled of hay and horses below. Caleb had already hauled up 2 plank benches balanced on feed crates and scrubbed a table clean enough for books. A note had been nailed beside the ladder before sunrise. Creed says families who send children will remember it at pay time. Caleb had torn off the signatureless corner and left the threat where every adult could see what courage was costing. "You worked before sunrise," Ivy said. "I usually do. For cattle perhaps, not for school." Felt rude to invite a teacher into a loft and leave her no place for the books. Me came up the ladder with Luz at her heels and Benji behind them, carrying his shoes because Marta had ordered all 3 not to track the barn floor into their education. At first they sat stiffly, like children who had been told they were lucky to be tolerated. Ivy changed that by asking questions no one could answer with yes or no. By the second hour Me was laughing. Luz read a whole line without swallowing the final word. Benji counted fence posts from memory so accurately that Ivy suspected he had been doing arithmetic in his head all along and only lacked a place where it counted. When she turned from the blackboard she had improvised from a coal-scrubbed feed plank, Caleb was at the loft door with a hammer in one hand and sunlight across one shoulder. He had paused there without interrupting, listening. The sight of him watching her teach did something strange to Ivy's breathing. Not because he stared, quite the opposite. He watched with the attentive gravity of a man witnessing a thing he had missed longer than he liked to admit. "Bench leg splits if the younger ones swing," he said quietly when the lesson ended. "Then they shall not swing. Children often disappoint orders. Then I shall teach them disappointment too." He looked at the chalk dust on her sleeve and the smudge on her cheek where she had pushed back a curl of hair. "Looks as if you already have." Me groaned because children understood adult, whether before adults named it. Ivy busied herself stacking slates. "Will they come tomorrow?" she asked the room more than him. "If their parents don't lose courage overnight," Marta called from below. "And if they do, I may drag them by the ear myself." For 2 days courage held, but it did not hold quietly. One mother sent word that her husband had been warned off. Tomas came late because Creed had kept him hauling ore past dawn. Every lesson felt less like a school day and more like a small gate being held shut against a larger hand. On the 3rd, Ivy rode back into town to fetch the rest of her belongings from Mrs. Vale's boarding house and purchase more slate pencils. Me came with her. Caleb had intended to join later after seeing to a lame gelding, but Ivy told him she could carry one trunk and one child without requiring rescue. Dry Creek had rearranged itself around her absence, not physically, morally. Men who had ignored her arrival now tipped hats with the exaggerated care of those who wished to appear blameless later. Women looked curious, then guarded, then embarrassed. A chalk notice had gone up beside the mercantile door. Private lessons held outside town are not the concern of the Dry Creek School Board. Outside town, me muttered. As if children become less real beyond their porch rails, Ivy said. Mrs. Vale met them on the boarding house porch with red eyes and a mouth pressed almost white. "I'm sorry," she blurted before Ivy reached the steps. "I truly am." "For what?" Mrs. Vale looked over her shoulder as though Agnes might materialize out of the wallpaper. "Your room. It's no longer mine to let." "No longer yours." "The board's account settled my flour bill last winter. Mrs. Halversen says if I keep you here, it will not settle the next." It was neatly done, not rage, leverage. "You promised me a week," Ivy said. "I know." Me's shoulders had gone stiff. Ivy laid one hand lightly on the girl's arm, not to silence her, but to remind them both where the real shame belonged. "Then I shall fetch my trunk and save you further difficulty," Ivy said. Mrs. Vale's eyes filled all at once. "There's more. Mr. Creed told Tomas's wife that if Luz keeps climbing that hayloft ladder, Tomas can look for work somewhere else." For one dangerous second Ivy saw the whole machine under the town's polite face. Agnes with her contracts, Silas Creed with his wages. The school was not closed because no one needed it. It was closed because need, if educated, grew harder to command. She carried her trunk down herself. On the way out she noticed a folded packet shoved halfway behind the bureau leg. Old school papers, yellowed and forgotten. She took them on instinct. At the mercantile counter, the clerk would not meet her eye when he told her slates had been sold out that morning. "To whom?" Ivy asked. "Can't say." "You can, you choose not to." He flinched and bent to straightening a shelf of penny candy, as if commerce had suddenly become urgent. By the time she and me reached the hitch rail again, Caleb was there. He had not spoken to anyone yet, which meant he had already seen enough. "No room?" he asked. "None they can afford." "And the pencils?" "Gone." Me spoke then, fast and furious. Mrs. Vale cried and said Mr. Creed is docking wages, and Mrs. Halversen says the school isn't a school if it's on our ranch, and everyone in town is mean in the face and cowardly in the eyes. Ivy tried not to smile. Caleb failed less successfully. "That's so," he said. Me crossed her arms. "Yes." He took Ivy's trunk from her hand. "Come on." "Where?" "Main Street first." He carried the trunk not toward the wagon but toward Mrs. Vale's porch. People turned before they meant to. The whole street could feel a public act arriving and had already begun to gather its innocence. Caleb set the trunk down on the boardwalk, pulled a folded billfold from his pocket, and called Mrs. Vale by name until she came to the door trembling. "You charged Miss Rowan a week," he said. "I am paying that week whether she sleeps under your roof or not. Mr. Mercer, please don't make this harder." "It is already hard." He counted notes into her hand. "This is for room, meals, and whatever trouble the board thinks it can sell you. If anyone says you were not paid, tell them to come settle with me." Silas Creed had been standing near the livery all along. Ivy knew him at once by the way other men angled themselves around his importance. He was compact, broad, dressed more richly than the street deserved, and wore the smile of a man who confused obedience with respect. "Mercer," he said, strolling over, "you've grown charitable." "Only particular." "Particular enough to forget who hauls your beef this fall." Caleb did not turn fully toward him. If your contract requires me to leave children stupid, write me a new one. A little current went through the street. This was no longer about a room. It was about who could speak plainly in Dry Creek without paying for it. Silas's smile flattened. You're sentimental because your niece likes letters. That's a costly weakness in a dry year. Maybe, Caleb said. Still cheaper than being the sort of man who fears a slate. The clerk at the mercantile laughed before remembering his wages. Silence rushed back over it, too late. Silas's gaze flicked to Ivy. This town has no quarrel with you if you move on. That would be more convincing if you weren't threatening men for their daughters' school books, she said. Girls learn what they need from their mothers. Then why are you afraid of what they might learn from me? He looked at her as if a piece of furniture had answered back. Agnes, appearing from nowhere as polished women of order often did, crossed the street with her gloves buttoned to the wrist. Mr. Creed, this spectacle helps no one, she said. Then to Ivy, Miss Rowan, you are making decent families choose between employment and vanity. Literacy is a strange vanity. For girls who will marry laborers and for boys who can earn cash at 10, Agnes said softly. Yes, it is. The children at the hitch rail had gone very still. Caleb turned to Ivy. Get the wagon. I am not finished buying supplies. Then we'll buy them elsewhere. There is nowhere else. That was true. It also made his next decision harder. He stood a moment, reading a street that had read him wrongly for years. Then we'll make them, he said. He bought slate scraps from the stonemason's boy, chalk from the chapel cellar, and a keg of nails he had not intended to need. When Silas passed him later without a handshake on the freight matter, everyone noticed. By sunset, Caleb Mercer had paid publicly for Ivy's room, lost publicly the easiest contract in the valley, and driven her home with the new weight of cost sitting quiet between them in the wagon. You should not have done that for me, Ivy said. I didn't do it for you alone. No, you did it for the children, and for your niece, and perhaps because you dislike being ordered. All true, but also for me. His hand stayed steady on the reins. Yes. The word had no performance in it. That made it settle deeper. At the ranch, while me ran ahead to tell Marta everything in 3 contradictory versions, Ivy opened the forgotten packet she had pulled from behind the boarding house bureau. Old board notices, copy sheets, and beneath them, folded twice and stained at the edge, a petition bearing 6 parent signatures requesting the summer term be suspended. At first she saw only the obvious. Then the teacher in her noticed the shapes of letters, the same slant, the same cramped capital R, the same loop on every Y. A petition signed by different hands should not look like a classroom punishment written 6 times by one stubborn child. Me had come back quietly and was leaning at Ivy's shoulder when the girl suddenly inhaled. That's Mama's name, she whispered. Ivy looked down. Ellen Mercer, 3rd line. Your mother signed this. Me shook her head too hard. She died in March before school shut. The room seemed to narrow around the paper. Are you sure? Me laid one finger on the line below it. And Mrs. Lowry moved away in winter, and Benji's ma can't write at all. She makes an X. Fraud had a face now, not just cruelty, design. That night the tack room glowed with one lantern, because the house kitchen was too full of anger for quiet thinking. Ivy spread the petition on an overturned grain bin and compared it with notices from the old packet. Agnes Halversen's hand was everywhere, only disguised by care. She did not hear Caleb come in until he set a mug of coffee beside her elbow. Marta said if I left you alone with that paper, you'd forget to eat again, he said. Ivy pushed the petition toward him. Your sister signed school papers. Sometimes slow but proud of it. This isn't her hand. He bent over the names. In lantern light the lines looked uglier, perhaps because they were trying harder to pass as neat. Me said Ellen was dead before the closure. Mrs. Lorry gone. Benji's mother marks with an X. He was silent so long Ivy feared she had been wrong and opened a wound without need. Then he set one finger, careful and broad, on Ellen Mercer's forged name. I watched my sister practice this E for 6 winters, he said. She curled the last stroke back like a fish hook. This one's Agnes. You know her hand. She wrote the notices after Ellen died, condolence cards, board minutes, requests. Something grim shifted through him. She's been deciding who counts in this town since before me was born. Ivy sat back. Then we can force it. Can we? Not with paper alone. Dry Creek trusts paper only when the right people hold it. She looked toward the dark window where the loft stood beyond. But if the children read their lesson in public, and then that petition, in the schoolhouse itself, Agnes cannot call education a vanity while using forged names to kill it. Superintendent Bell passes through next Thursday, he said at last. Agnes will show him a tidy street, a healthy ledger, and a locked door she calls temporary. Then we shall show him a class. In the loft. No, in the schoolhouse. She has the key. Keys are not law. In Dry Creek they often pass for it. She folded the petition. Then perhaps Dry Creek has mistaken itself for the entire world. Something like admiration moved through his face before caution could flatten it. He sat on the opposite grain bin and pulled a worn primer from the shelf above the harness hooks. This was Ellen's, he said. The cover had come loose at one corner. Inside the front page, in a looping hand very different from Agnes's, was written Ellen Mercer, keep at it. Me uses it sometimes, he stopped. You what? I stumble through with her when work allows. He gave a brief, self-mocking breath. Town found that funny after Ellen died, a grown man sounding out words his kid niece already knew. There it was at last, the loneliness under the steadiness. Not only a house without a woman, a man without permission to want gentleness or learning or any future not made entirely of weather and profit. Ivy opened the primer. Read to me. He shook his head at once. No. Why not? Because I'm slow, and because you already know the words. I know many words. That has never prevented me from liking to hear them. For a long second she thought he would refuse again. Then he took the book, held it under the lantern and began. Halting, yes, careful, a man stepping where laughter had once made him misjudge the ground. She did not help until he asked. When he missed a line, she waited. When he got one right, she let the rightness stand without praise sharp enough to humiliate. By the end of the page, his voice had settled. Better, she asked softly. With you not looking at me like a fool, yes. I am looking at you like a student. That's worse. Not in my experience. He gave her the faintest laugh. Outside, a horse stamped. Inside, the lantern hummed. Ivy realized she had stopped thinking about the stage timetable folded in her trunk. Not because Dry Creek had become kind, but because one honest room could outweigh a whole mean street if a person was tired enough of leaving. If you love clean frontier romances where one brave choice changes a whole future, stay with this story and subscribe for more. I meant what I said in town, he said after a while, about doing it for you too. She kept her eyes on the primer because his were too direct in that light. I know. No, he said, I don't think you do. I saw you kneel in dust before you argued for yourself. Most people here only fight for what touches their own plate. You fought for children you'd known 5 minutes. Hard not to. Notice that. Her pulse shifted, warm and inconvenient. And you built benches before asking whether I could be trusted not to waste them, she said. Hard not to notice that too. Neither moved. The space between them stayed respectful and therefore more dangerous than carelessness would have been. At length Ivy reached into her satchel, took out the stage timetable and tore it once down the middle, then once again. "What was that?" he asked. "My easier road." He looked at the torn pieces in her hand, and something open and startled passed through his face before he controlled it. "Ivy." It was the first time he had used her given name. "We reopen the school next Thursday," she said. "If I'm to be ruined in Dry Creek, it may as well be for a proper cause." He stood then, slow as if rising under more feeling than he preferred to show. "Then I'll get more lumber tomorrow." She ought to have laughed. Instead she said, "Good." The days between decision and battle filled fast. Word spread that the loft school would hold a public lesson when Superintendent Bell came through. That gave the children a purpose larger than their fear. It also gave Agnes and Sela's time to sharpen theirs. Two fathers pulled their daughters out for 3 days after Mr. Creed reminded them how easily hauling assignments were rearranged. Benji arrived one morning with a bruise on his jaw from an older cousin who said boys who liked slates grew up to weigh nothing. Me was mocked at the mercantile for carrying books wrapped in flour cloth. Marta answered by marching into town herself and buying calico ribbon for every girl's copybook so the sight of learning would be impossible to mistake for shame. Caleb built a proper blackboard from planed wood painted with stove blacking. He hung a sign over the loft rail that read Cedar Ridge School in Ivy's careful hand. When she protested that such a sign invited retaliation, he said only, "That's the point." The retaliation came at the church social on Tuesday night. Dry Creek socials were the sort of events where women carried pies like evidence of virtue and men pretended conversation had not been arranged with the same precision as seating charts. Ivy went because not going would allow Agnes to define absence as guilt. She wore her blue-gray dress and a plain white collar. Me went with Marta. Caleb came later after checking the north fence and stood near the back wall in a clean dark coat that made his shoulders look broader than the room had planned for. Agnes had placed the old school bell rope across a table of raffle quilts, coiled like an heirloom serpent. "A keepsake from our first term," she said to a knot of ladies as Ivy approached, "a reminder that some seasons pass." Ivy stopped beside the table, "So do certain chairwomen." The ladies swallowed smiles behind gloved fingers. Agnes's own smile thinned to steel. "You mistake stubbornness for destiny." "No, I mistake forged signatures for fraud." Around them conversation dipped. Agnes's hand froze on the bell rope a fraction too long. "Careful," she said. "You first." Sela's Creed appeared at Agnes's side with a glass in one hand. "Miss Rowan, men are losing patience with this melodrama. Superintendent Bell is not coming to rescue a hayloft protest." "Good," Ivy said. "I dislike rescue. I prefer witnesses." "Witnesses to what?" "To children reading in a town that said they were not worth the chalk." Caleb had reached them by then. He did not touch Ivy. He did not need to. His presence at her shoulder changed the table's shape. "The lesson begins at 10, he told Sela's. "You can attend or admit you're afraid of your own argument." Agnes lifted her chin. "Mr. Mercer, your attachment to this woman's theatrics is becoming indecent." The room heard that, wanted it. Ivy felt heat rise under her collar and hated Agnes for choosing the oldest weapon in a polished woman's cabinet. Before she could answer, Caleb did. "What's indecent," he said, clear enough for half the hall, "is locking a school and then calling children impractical." Silence rippled outward. Agnes's eyes flashed. "You have grown reckless." "No," he said, "only tired." Ivy turned to him then, because there are moments when being publicly chosen feels more intimate than a hand at the waist. His face gave nothing away except certainty. For the first time, Dry Creek could no longer pretend whatever stood between them was mere accident or pity. She stepped forward on purpose. "If you mean to ruin my name," she said to Agnes. At least do it honestly. Tell the room you fear girls who can read what men write about them. Someone laughed outright. This time no silence could swallow it. Agnes set the bell rope down and swept away with the dignity of a general abandoning a hill she claimed not to need. Silas lingered only long enough to say, under his breath, "Families can't eat books." "No," Ivy said, "but they can starve without them." The next morning the North Pasture hands did not receive their freight chits. By noon Caleb learned Silas had suspended his fall advance on cattle already promised. That was the concrete loss, at last undeniable. Marta swore in Spanish till the kitchen windows shook. Ivy stood by the sink gripping it with both hands because this was the exact cost she had meant to avoid when she tore up the stage timetable. "I can still leave," she said once Caleb and she were alone on the porch. "You can." "There is a stage tomorrow morning," she said. "If I go, Silas might release your freight chits. The families might stop paying for my stubbornness." She hated how practical it sounded. The math of staying had finally turned into cost, and Ivy had always been good at math. "And if I did?" He'd still have shown his hand. Caleb leaned against the post, hat low. Only then he'd know one threat was enough. "You should be angry with me." "I am angry." He looked out toward the loft where me and Luz were pinning copy sheets to the rail. "Just not at you." She wanted, suddenly and foolishly, to reach for the sleeve of his coat and keep him there until the shape of their fear changed. Instead she said, "What if families do not come tomorrow?" "Some won't." "Then we lose." "No," he turned back to her. "If one wagon comes, Agnes loses the lie that no one wanted a school. If the children read, Silas loses the lie that learning is useless. If Belle hears the names, the rest follows." "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," his voice dropped, "it's just right." That steadied her more than comfort would have. On Thursday morning, the sun rose hard and gold over Dry Creek. Ivy unlocked the schoolhouse by means Caleb would never explain, and she had decided not to ask, since frontier morality often depended on what kind of lock a key was keeping. Dust motes filled the empty room like patient witnesses. The old desks had been shoved against the walls to make space for stored sacks. She and the children dragged them back into rows. Marta wiped windows. Me rang a borrowed handbell at the door every time another family wagon appeared, and each ring sounded like a small act of rebellion becoming habit. At 9:30, only 3 families had come. At 9:45 Tomas arrived with Luz, and 2 neighbor girls squeezed into the back of his wagon, and said he had lost half a day's wage already, and meant to make it count. At 10 Mrs. Pike came with Benji and both younger sisters because, as she told Ivy in a shaking voice, "If they can read a bill, maybe no one will ever cheat them the way they cheated me." At 10 past, Superintendent Horace Bell stepped down from a buckboard in a tan linen coat, and the expression of a man who had expected handshakes and found a frontier uprising instead. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked Agnes, who was at his side in her best silk, and Silas, who hovered just behind like money with boots. Agnes spread gloved hands. "A misunderstanding, Superintendent. A disappointed teacher holding an unauthorized exhibition." "In a locked public schoolhouse?" Ivy asked from the doorway. Bell blinked at her. "Miss Rowan, I presume?" "Yes, sir. Written for hired, and then told no child here needed me." "The board suspended term due to hardship." "Then let us see whether hardship includes children who can read and mothers, whose names are used without permission." Agnes stepped forward. "This is outrageous. You cannot let a classroom be governed by sentiment." "No," Ivy said, "only by truth." Bell looked like a man considering whether the next half hour belonged to justice or inconvenience. Ivy had seen that look from officials before. If he could step around conflict, he would. So she did not let him. "Sir," she said, If Dry Creek truly has no use for a school, 10 minutes will prove it. If these children cannot read, if their sums fail, if no parent wanted the term, I will leave on the noon stage and never trouble your district again. That pinned him, not because he admired courage, because public men disliked being seen refuse a fair test. Very well, he said at last. Agnes inhaled sharply. Silas muttered something about nonsense. Caleb, standing at the back wall with his hat in both hands, did not smile, but the set of his shoulders eased a fraction. Ivy brought the children forward one by one. Me read first from the primer, clear and steady despite the room full of adults who had told her for months that her hunger for letters was an inconvenience. Luz followed with figures on the board, adding freight totals faster than the mercantile clerk who had denied Ivy the slates. Benji read a paragraph on Western rivers, stumbling once, recovering without help, and finishing with his head up. The room had changed by then. What had started as spectacle was becoming evidence. Useful enough, Ivy asked mildly. Bell cleared his throat. Their instruction is respectable. Instruction they were not meant to have. Agnes took a step forward. Miss Rowan, no one forbade private tutoring. The board merely recognized fiscal reality. Then let us speak of reality. Ivy lifted the folded petition from her satchel. Is this the petition on which the summer term was closed? Agnes's answer came too fast, among other factors. Read the third name, Me. Me took the sheet. Her hands trembled only at first. Ellen Mercer, she read. Then she looked up, her voice gaining steel from the truth itself. My mother, she was dead before this was signed. A murmur moved through the room. Bell frowned. Agnes said, the girl is confused. Read the fifth, Ivy said. Mrs. Lowry. From the back, old Mr. Jebb barked. Lowry's headed for Pueblo in January. The seventh, Ivy said. Benji's mother spoke before the boy could. That's my name and I don't write it. I mark an X. Silas stepped in then, too late and too forcefully. Any petition in a frontier district gathers signatures by courtesy. The point is community sense, not penmanship. Community sense does not raise the dead, Ivy said. Marta, who had been waiting for this exact line all morning, slapped a small receipt book onto the front desk. And courtesy did not send school flour to Agnes Halversen's boarding house pantry under the school account. Bell stared. What is this? Board receipts, Ivy said. From the packet left in Mrs. Vale's room. Same hand. Same dates. School funds paying boarding house supplies after term suspension, while Mr. Creed hired children to sort ore and threatened ranch wages if families sent them to class. Silas flushed a thick, furious red. You have no proof I threatened anyone. You threatened Tomas in front of 3 men and a horse trough, Caleb said from the back. Tomas stepped forward, and me and Pike, and anyone with a hungry child. Bell looked toward Agnes. Madam. Agnes had gone very still, which in a woman like her meant desperation, had finally dropped all pretense of elegance. This district has survived because I kept it practical, she said. Books do not feed a settlement. Men with freight lines do. Women with orderly houses do. You cannot run a town on every sentimental hunger that wanders in from a stage. Ivy felt the room's anger turn, but anger alone was not enough. It needed shape. No, she said quietly. You run a town by deciding whose children may remain small. She took the petition back from me and held it where Bell could see the names. These children read because they are able, she said. These mothers came because they wanted better than dust. Mr. Mercer paid for that choice with his contract. Tomas paid with wages. Benji's mother paid with silence. What exactly have you paid, Mrs. Halversen, besides other people's futures? That was the last excuse gone. Bell exhaled through his nose and straightened as if authority, having avoided the room long enough, had reluctantly sat down inside him. By district authority, he said. This school is reopened effective immediately. Mrs. Halversen, you will surrender the board chair pending territorial review. Any account diverted from school use will be audited and repaid. Mr. Creed, if any child in this district is threatened or employed in violation of district schooling days, your contracts with school families will be noted and forwarded with my report. Silas took one step as if to argue. Then he saw the room, not love, not universal courage, something more useful, people calculating which power would still matter tomorrow. Caleb moved from the back wall at last, not toward Ivy but toward Belle, to say in the calm voice of a man placing a brand where all could see it, Dry Creek can haul its own beef till it relearns decency. Silas laughed without humor. You think the valley chooses a schoolmarm over freight? No, Mrs. Pike said, surprising everyone including herself. I think I choose bills my son can read. Tomas said, and my daughter over your ore tables. Old Jeb muttered, and maybe my grandsons over idiots. That was enough. Not a crowd flip, not sentimental thunder, just the sound of leverage changing hands. Agnes removed the schoolhouse key from her reticule, with fingers that had finally begun to shake. This town will regret indulging you, she said to Ivy. Perhaps, Ivy answered, but it will do so literally. Marta snorted so hard she had to cover it with a cough. Even Belle lost the battle with his mouth for half a second. Agnes did not look at Ivy then. She looked at Mrs. Pike, at Tomas, at the children, and at every face that had stopped waiting for her permission. It was not rage in her eyes. It was the first clear count of what she had spent and could not get back. Agnes laid the key on the desk as if surrendering a relic she had mistaken for a right. Silas left before anyone could enjoy his face too openly. Belle began speaking of district forms and replacement trustees, but Ivy barely heard him. Mee had both hands over her mouth. Luz was smiling like sunrise. Benji was touching the chalk board as if checking whether victory had weight. Caleb came to her, only once the room had burst into 10 smaller conversations. Miss Rowan, he said in a tone so formal it startled her. Mr. Mercer. He held out the key. Seems the school prefers its teacher. She took it. Their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, entirely public, and still enough to send a warm line all the way to her ribs. Thank you, she said. For what? For the room, the benches, the contract, the fact that when this town tried to make me expensive, you made me possible. You made yourself possible, Ivy. I just hated the waste. The afternoon ran long with sweeping, sorting, moving sacks out, moving desks in. Belle left copies of forms. Mrs. Vale arrived with lemonade and tears and apologies, and an offer to host teachers gratis forever if anyone would let her start over. Ivy accepted the lemonade and postponed absolution. There would be time enough later to decide which repentances were sturdy. By sunset the schoolhouse looked like a room returned to itself. The chain was gone. The bell rope had not yet been rehung, but Caleb had taken it to clean and splice where age had frayed it. The children had finally been sent home with strict instructions not to overlearn before Monday. Marta had marched me toward the ranch wagon to force supper into her before triumph replaced blood in her body. Ivy stayed behind to stack primers in the front cupboard. The silence after a hard-won day was different from loneliness. It held shape, intention, a place waiting to be used again. When she stepped outside, Caleb was on the ladder beneath the bell frame, sleeves rolled, fitting the restored rope through the wheel. The sky behind him was copper and rose. Dust floated gold above Main Street. For one moment, he looked like an answer. Ivy had not let herself form the question until right then. You're still working, she said. Seems a shame to leave a bell mute on its first honest evening. He climbed down. In his hand was not only the rope but a second, smaller key on a leather thong. Bell repaired, he said, And Belle, the superintendent, said the district cupboard key may as well stay with the woman who will open it. You acquired that quickly. He likes decisive teachers, or feared Marta. A rational fear. He stood before her, the schoolhouse at her back, the last light on his face. The whole day seemed to narrow to the space between one breath and the next. Ivy, he said, I don't want to make tonight sound like a bargain because it isn't one. Good. Good. He looked down at the key and then up again. You have the school now, the children, your own room in town if you want one, and your own standing whether this valley behaves itself or not. I know. So what I say next isn't payment for any of that. Her hand tightened around the cupboard key. All right. The road from town to Cedar Ridge is 5 miles. You've traveled it enough to know every rut by now. His voice was low, steady, and far braver than the room full of men bravery she had seen earlier. I would like it if you kept traveling it on Sundays, for supper at first, for quiet if you want it, for me, who already talks of you as if the Ridge invented teachers. And for me, because I am tired of making room for you in every part of my life, except the one where men speak plain. Her heart did a reckless thing against her ribs. Are you courting me, Mr. Mercer? If you'll allow a man who reads slowly to begin there. She laughed then, helplessly and with more joy than the day had yet permitted. That is not the worst proposal I have ever heard. It isn't a proposal. No, but it has proposal weather. For the first time he smiled without reserve, and she saw what Dry Creek had been denied simply because loneliness had become his habit. Then let me improve it, he said. Do not come because you owe me the contract or the benches or the room. Come because, when this town told you to leave, the best thing I have done in years was build a place and hope you might use it. There it was, no ownership, no rescue, just truth laid down clean between them. Ivy slid the new key onto the same chain as the schoolhouse one, work and future, warm against her palm. I will come Sunday, she said, and Monday, and every day after that the school requires me. And if one day the road feels like home. She stepped past him to the schoolhouse door, locked it with her own key, and turned back with the evening at her shoulders. Then I suppose, she said, you may walk beside me while I decide how much of it belongs to you. He let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. She reached for the bell rope and gave it one firm pull. The sound rolled over Dry Creek, clear and full and impossible to mistake for surrender. Marta shouted from the wagon that if they meant to begin a romance they could do it after supper because Beans waited for no one. Me laughed so hard she nearly fell off the seat. Even from the far end of the street, Mrs. Pike lifted one hand in salute. Caleb offered Ivy his arm only after the bell's last note faded. She took it because she wanted to, because the key was in her pocket and the choice was in her own hand, and because this road, for once, was leading somewhere she had not been forced to earn by leaving first. If this ending felt worth the journey, subscribe for more clean Wild West love stories where home is chosen the hard way.